You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Welcome, friend, to episode 157 of the Business for Good podcast. If you're consuming this episode near the time of its release, I wish you a very happy new year and hope you had a nice holiday season. Even though my wife, Tony, isn't Jewish, she's quite happy to celebrate the holiday in the ancient tradition, likely mandated by the Torah, which, of course, is to say that we celebrated Christmas by eating Chinese food on Christmas night. If you're joining us for the first time, there's really a lot of great evergreen back content just waiting for you to sample. If you're not sure where to start, we have a list of fan-favorite episodes on the homepage at businessforgoodpodcast.com, so go check that out and maybe start there. Speaking of the website, if you have feedback on the show, maybe it's things you like or things that you think could improve about the show, please let me know. Send an email via the form at businessforgoodpodcast.com, and I promise I will get back to you. Now, I'm excited about this episode since our guest is doing something so important in the world. In this conversation, we're taking you on a journey to some of the most remote corners of West Africa where energy access is scarce and innovation is changing lives. Our guest is Nicole Poindexter, the founder and CEO of Energicity, a 100-person strong company that's bringing clean, reliable solar power to off-grid communities in countries like Sierra Leone, Benin, and Liberia. Nicole and her team are doing something extraordinary, building solar mini-grids that provide electricity to tens of thousands of people who otherwise rely on polluting and expensive energy sources or who have no power at all. And impressively, Energicity is doing all of this while making a profit, already being an EBITDA-positive company. In our conversation, Nicole shares how she transitioned from a background in finance after an Ivy League education at Yale and Harvard to founding Energicity in 2015, driven by her vision to end energy poverty. We dive deep into how solar mini-grids are more than just a source of light. They're catalysts for economic growth, education, and health improvements in communities that have often been ignored. Nicole also talks candidly about the challenges of working in rural Africa, from financing to infrastructure to cultural dynamics, and how she tackles these head on. One part of this conversation that really resonated with me, and I think will with a lot of founders, is when Nicole says that she takes to heart the saying, "Those who know how work for those who know why." So many people see a problem, and because they don't know how to solve it, they don't act. Nicole makes it clear that if you surround yourself with smart people of whom you can ask many questions, combining those with know how with those who know why can really lead to transformational results. So if you're ready to get inspired by a trailblazer who's proving that business can indeed be a force for good in the world, stay tuned for this enlightening conversation with Nicole Poindexter. Nicole, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
How great. Thanks, Paul. It's really great to be here with you.
Hey, it's really nice to be chatting with you. You have a background that many people would not think that you were going to be starting your own company that's going to be doing work in rural Africa. You went to Yale undergrad, you have a degree, and you have an MBA from Harvard. A lot of the people you went to school with are probably thinking, like, how can I get on the Supreme Court? Or they're, running like Fortune 500 companies by now. What led you to do this? How did you go from the Ivy League to rural Africa?
So I've done a bunch of different things in my career. I was a banker. I was a venture capitalist. I ran operations for a Fortune 500 company. And I have also tried to start a couple of companies along the way. And in 2008, I started a company. Wasn't a great idea, honestly, in retrospect. Only my mother thinks it was, but
what was the idea? What was the idea? I presume it failed if you think it wasn't a good idea in hindsight, but what was the idea?
It was, so my thesis was the important thing that iTunes did for music, and again, this is 2008, was not just digitizing, but making music available at the level of song as opposed to the level of album. And I love books. I've been in book publishing. I had worked in book publishing, and that I thought that you could do the same thing for the ideas in books. And, we're starting with cookbooks and, health books and things like that. But can you create bite-sized chunks of content and then allow people to mix them up and kind of you can create your own Spotify list or playlist on whatever.
That's interesting.
Your music thing.
I could see that working. I could see it working with recipes, like with cookbooks. You don't need 100 recipes, but you might like this author and want one or two of their works.
Exactly. Exactly. It's not the worst idea ever, but not a huge market. And really just not a compelling business. But that said, I also had really greats and air quotes, market timing. I have this very enthusiastic email I wrote to someone in September 8th of 2008 saying, fundraising is looking really promising. The markets started crashing about 2 weeks later with the fall of Lehman. And so the business went nowhere. I had nothing to do. And if you remember back to that time, we just really weren't sure what was going to happen with the economy. So I was a bit lost, but I knew that I'd always been interested in energy and went to organize a conference on the smart grid. From there, I got a job in a early stage startup called O-Power at the time, and was one of the early employees there, learned a lot about software, learned a lot about utilities, learned a lot about energy. And O-Power went public in 2014. And I was early enough to have some flexibility, if not early enough to retire. But I did have enough money to have some flexibility. And I thought about what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a difference. I was interested in energy and, in fact, interested in the question of what does it take to have 100% renewables on the grid, and not something you can test in the US. There's
why, in hindsight, that may be so, but why is it that renewables at 100% are not possible in the US?
You couldn't test it in the US. I'm not saying it's not possible, never possible, but at that time, we only had 1% renewables on the grid. And that might have been 1% solar. There's some places with a considerable amount of hydro, but we were going from 1% with a whole lot of established infrastructure to 100. That's just a huge gap. And it just did not seem testable. But I'd heard that there were parts of Africa that did not have energy infrastructure at all. And now that sounds super naive. At the time, it wasn't quite as naive. When I was in business school, I worked in Zimbabwe, and they had a fully functioning grid at the time, at least in Harare, the city that I was working in. And just after business school, I worked in South Africa. And again, they had a fully functioning grid. So my experience of Africa is Africa without electricity, but that is not really the real story. So I'd heard this and was like, let me do some research. And honestly, I looked at a YouTube video and I saw what people's lives were like without electricity. And they're, people living in pre-industrial circumstances. There's this guy who was using a forge powered by his feet as he's trying to increase the fire so that he could, hammer some metal. I saw kids coughing because people are cooking inside their houses with flames and, with fire. And I was like, this isn't acceptable. It's not acceptable that people are living like that. And I'm upset when I'm at a Starbucks and they're steaming my coffee and I don't have a plug next to me. So it's just not acceptable. So
yeah, I do think about what you just said very often, and how those of us who live in the developed world have things that bother us that would be a dream come true if somebody from the developing world could experience that problem.
Yes.
Like what you just mentioned at Starbucks, or if something, something on my car doesn't, stops working or something these are inconveniences to us. But, our worst days are the dreams come true of probably more than 1 billion other people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. So true. And so having been a banker, I built a financial model, and having worked in the space that I'd worked at O-Power, actually not. I looked for some regulators, but I called up a friend of mine who lived in Ghana. It's the only person really that I knew on the entire continent of Africa. And I was like, hey, do you think I could make a difference in this? And at the time, they were going through a power crisis. The parts of Ghana that had electricity would have outages for 36 hours and power for 12. And he's like, if you can help us with our power problems, you'd be a hero. And so got on a plane, met with the regulators, and then I went to some rural villages, and the people in the villages, I thought they were going to say I was crazy, but actually what they said was, can you bring us power tomorrow? And by the end of that trip, I felt like I'd promised. So it was really that promise is why I started this company. And it's kind of been one foot in front of the other since.
It's an impressive thing, right? So most people see a problem in the world. They're not going to be on the next plane to West Africa to try to solve it, right? So obviously there's something special about you, Nicole. I do want to ask, though, like the way that you're describing it, to me, it sounds as if a charity could be deployed to do this, right? Now, I know you're going to say that it needs to be a business. So what is the business opportunity, right? I can see why somebody from some philanthropic charity could say, oh, these people are suffering without electricity. We need to bring them clean, renewable electricity. Let's go do that. You're saying you think there's a profitable business here, right? That people can actually make money by providing renewable energy in Western Africa. So what is the business model? How do you, in these developing areas, make money by selling power?
So we make money the same way. And I don't know if you're in Southern California or Northern California, but the same way Southern California Energy or Southern California Edison does. We sell electricity, and we sell electricity to people who want it. And we sell electricity to people who spent more not having electricity than they spend on our electricity. And what that means is if you don't have electricity, typically people have a phone, but you pay someone $1 a charge to charge your phone. Mm-hmm. If you don't have electricity, your food spoils every day because you don't have refrigeration. If you don't have electricity, your kids can't study at night, which is kind of a charitable thing in a certain sense. But in the other sense, people invest in the United States billions to ensure that their kids get a good education and the best advantages that they can afford. So there is a very clear business case. There are people who don't have a lot of money, but they can actually be more efficient with their funds and get much more value if they spend it on electricity that we provide using renewable energy. So we've got willing customers and a product. That's a business.
Well, let's talk about that product because it's not just electricity, right? You have a solar powered mini grid. So for those who are not, inducted into the world of energy business, what is a solar powered mini grid? What does that even entail?
Sure. So our product is electricity. The solar powered mini grid is what we install in order to provide electricity. And what that is we go into a village and we find a piece of land and we install a centralized solar farm. We have batteries so that the energy produced by the solar is stored and can provide electricity overnight. We have poles and wires, just like your utility at wherever you are may have. Poles and wires that bring the electricity to each person's house. And then we have smart meters on each person's house to measure how much electricity they use. So we're identical to your utility, except we serve small communities that have to be very poor.
Why is nobody else doing this, right? Or like if the big utilities thought there was money to be made doing this, presumably they would do it. So why does it take a startup like Energicity?
So there are, in fact, in Africa, so I thought everyone had electricity. In fact, there are at least 600 million people in Africa who do not have electricity. And providing electricity to some of the world's poorest people who live in rural areas using a technology we have never used at 100% on a grid. And never is a strong word. I think that there are different experiments in other places. But for the most part, we have not used 100% solar to provide electricity on a 24-hour basis. That requires innovation. Doing all those things, serving a group of people who have never been served before, serving a group of people who have been ignored by the marketplace, that requires innovation. And that's what entrepreneurial companies are great at. Utilities, on the other hand, and while there's some really great innovations going on in utilities, they're big companies. It's hard to sort of incubate and start something that inherently kind of has to be small. We're serving a village that is 500 households with 50 kilowatt system. That's hard for a large company to get their minds around. So I do expect that large utilities will be in this industry. I expect that they will be in this industry because they've bought smaller companies like ours after we've achieved significant scale.
Mm-hmm. And obviously 50 kilowatts is not significant scale, but what do you think of as significant scale that would actually be attractive to them?
So we are targeting achieving 3 million customers over the course of the next 4 years, before 2030. That size, at that size, we'd probably be, and I don't actually know the number, about $100 million a year company.
Mm-hmm.
I think that.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And the company today is where?
We're much smaller,
Yeah.
but we are looking at an acquisition. I'll just say that
Wow.
as a
Okay.
teaser. But we are a Series A, raising
Right.
Series A now, actually.
Right. So I read that you've raised $10 million so far. Is that accurate? Cool. Yeah.
A little bit more, but yes.
A little bit more. All right. Congratulations. How many folks work at Energicity now?
We have approximately 100 people. Of that, there's about 50 of them are professional staff, and about 50 of them are rural technicians. They're working in the communities and they inspect our solar on a daily basis.
For a lot of companies that have a $10 million raise, the idea of having 100 employees it's vastly more than what they would hire. So I presume you're going to say you could do that because these folks are working in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Benin and making much less than what the energy worker in the United States makes. Is that right?
That is exactly the case.
Right. And so how many of your staff are in the United States?
I have 2 United States citizens on staff.
Okay.
And most of the time we're both in Africa.
Really? You spend most of your time in Africa?
I do. I spend about 9 months out of the year in Africa.
Wow. And I mean, I don't want to pry, but I know you have a family. So how do you make this work if you're gone 9 months out of the year? Are they going with you to Liberia and Sierra Leone, or are they staying in the U.S.?
No. So I have a family, meaning I am the daughter of a mother and father and the sister of and aunt too, but I do not have a husband and kids of my own.
Right. Okay. Well, as somebody who, I have my own toe is in the entrepreneurial waters, running my own startup for the last 7 years, and I don't have kids. I have a wife, but I don't have kids, and I don't comprehend how anybody does it with kids. I cannot imagine how it would be possible. And I know they do. I know they do. I just, it's such an all-consuming endeavor. I just can't envision how it gets done.
Every time I'm at home, and I am an aunt and a child, not a mother and wife. Every time I'm at home, I ask my friends who have kids how on earth they work. Forget running a company. How they work.
Yeah, no, that's a good line. It reminds me, I was listening to an interview with the guy who started Peloton, and when they were going through some really rough times, not as pre-pandemic when they really took off, and I guess they had some rough times after the pandemic too. But either way, he had this line. I can't believe it was true, but he said it on this interview that I heard, where his wife asked him, "Look, can we just commit to having dinner one night a week together?" And he said that he would consent to one dinner per night or one dinner per week if she would consent that during that dinner they would talk about what they would do when the business went belly up and how they would afford their mortgage. And I thought, wow, what a pleasure to be married to this guy. I hope it's not true. He said it as if it were true, and I hope it wasn't for the sake of his marriage. But yeah, it's just it's really incredible. Well, let me ask you then, as somebody who obviously grew up in America, you're spending 9 months out of your year in Africa now. How much is the culture shock for you?
In a certain respect, so I would traveled back and forth a lot before the pandemic, but I got locked down in Sierra Leone during the pandemic. Like, they closed the airport and I could not leave. And that was initially a little stressful, probably less because I was in Sierra Leone and more because there was a global pandemic, but it really grew to feel like home. And it's the cultural difference. So I don't live in a rural village. I live in the capital city. And, the cultural difference, a lot of it is it's just like a small town. People are very friendly. I can't walk from my house to the main road without several people saying hi to me and good morning. And I feel obliged to speak back. That's not how I lived in New York City. So, there's less choice at a grocery store, for example. They've got 4 vegetables. I will figure out what I'm going to make with those 4 vegetables. But sometimes I kind of feel like in the States, we've got too much choice. So I actually quite enjoy it. There are some challenges in the main city in Sierra Leone. There are power cuts that are, I can go a long time without power. That's hard.
You need Energicity.
I do. I know we need to take over the utility in the main city.
Yeah.
But so there are definitely challenges, but I think what I enjoy about being there is the way people deal with those challenges. They often deal with grace and appreciation for what they have. And, that's a little bit different from how we live our lives in the States, even me when I'm in the States, but it's actually quite nice.
Yeah, I can imagine. I certainly agree. Like when I go to the grocery store, I just think certainly 90+% of the things that are on the shelves here need not exist. Like I like that is how I feel when I go in there. Like just like so much of this. What is the purpose of it? Anyway, just back to the product that you're selling. You mentioned, Nicole, you're selling electricity that is being generated from these little mini solar farms that you are doing. But you also mentioned that there's real innovation that you as a startup are doing that maybe these big utilities don't want to do. What is the actual innovation, right? Like, I mean, you can get solar panels and batteries anywhere. So what is the innovation of Energicity?
So we've got innovation at two different levels. One is process. And it's interesting. Our main investor to date is a fund called Ecosystem Integrity Fund. And they are a pretty successful impact venture fund. What they are most interested in are using tested technology. So they're not on the cutting edge of technology, but using tested technologies in innovative spaces that enable, a cleaner planet. And that's really what we do. And so a lot of the innovation is process, how we're deploying mini grids. Part of the innovation is really what we learn from our customers. These customers are people who make $5 a day. And for instance, we listen to them. And one of the first big lessons we learned from them is that their biggest obstacle to using electricity to increase their livelihood isn't the availability of electricity, but it's the availability of capital. And so we started leasing freezers, leasing grain mills, now leasing electric bikes to people in these communities so that they can use the electricity to make themselves wealthier. We learned that by listening to our customers. There are other companies who provide electricity through mini grids. Most others do not do this. We outperform because we listen to our customers and we're delivering services in ways that actually meet customers' needs. And then the other way in which we're innovating, which is on the technology side, is that we've built our own software platform. We actually designed smart meters that are very specifically tailored to the needs of mini grids. And then we've designed our own software platform, which also particular to the technical needs of mini grids, but also the customer needs. And what I often say about our software platform is like every heartbreak, every lesson we've learned, every painful lesson we've learned, we've embedded it in the software. We've embedded the learnings in the software. So we have now systematized that we don't make those mistakes the next time. And so innovation on all three fronts.
Yeah. What's the biggest pain point that you've had so far?
Raising money.
Yeah. You were in the VC shoes, right? You were on that side of the table. Now you're on the other side of the table. And, I don't know when you were a VC. I presume it was prior to Energicity, right? So prior to 2015 when you started the company. But, it's been quite a wild ride for me to see how it really was a founder's market, even like, let's say 2021, 2022. And now, I mean, quite the opposite. Needless to say, like there's just not a lot of venture capital go to around unless you're in AI. And it reminds me of, have you ever heard of the hors d'oeuvres theory of fundraising? So
no.
The hors d'oeuvre, yeah. So it's basically, if let's say you're at a, some party and they've got, waiters coming out of the kitchen with a plate full of food. The best time to take that is when they pass you, right? Because you think there's just an endless array of these like stuffed mushrooms that are coming out, but there may not be any more stuffed mushrooms, So when they pass you, you should take that stuffed mushroom. And the same is so with fundraising. Like when people make an offer, generally speaking, don't turn it down. And in this day and era where we see startups doing mass layoffs and collapsing altogether every day, it's a good reminder of that for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, and for us, we've got a unique challenge, but also a benefit. So first of all, when you asked about the innovation, oh yes, and we have AI, because heaven forbid these days I forget to mention that. But the first challenge we have in raising money is a question that you asked early on. Why is this a business and not a charity? And so a lot of investors have a very hard time figuring out what bucket to put this in. But, we generate real returns. We're EBITDA positive, which, again, not a lot of early stage companies can say.
Very rare. Very rare. That's pleasantly shocking to me. Congratulations.
So we're a real business, but a lot of people sort of struggle with how to think about it. They want to use their DAF to invest, but, oh, wait, we're not a nonprofit. So that's one.
Sorry to interrupt you. For those of you not familiar with the acronym DAF, it's Donor Advised Fund. So basically, somebody's family has a fund that they're going to donate to the company. But got it. All right, Please go on. Sorry.
Thank you. And so the second piece is Africa risk, perceived risk. And so, people have only heard bad stories about Africa or charitable stories about Africa. And very rarely do they hear about, real businesses delivering product, delivering services and making profit. And so, we don't fit the pattern recognition for a lot of folks. In fact, most funds don't even have permission to invest in Africa. So that limits the scope of the investors that we can talk to. That said, I'd say, unlike some of the challenges that a lot of companies have, because we're a particular order, to kind of mangle your metaphor, our investors are really supportive. And so, we're very fortunate to have the ones that we have, and they get what we're doing and why, and they've been very supportive.
Cool. So that's the concern about, let's say, like American investors who may not want to invest in an African-based business. What about in Africa? So, you're dealing in countries that, there probably isn't a big VC community like there is. And there may also, actually, let me just ask you, so Liberia has had a female head of state. I remember when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was there. I don't think she's the head of state in Liberia anymore, but I remember when she was there. But I don't know if the other countries you're working in, like Sierra Leone, have ever had a female head of state. But as the CEO of this company, you're dealing with cultures that may not be familiar with seeing women in power. Is that accurate, or is that a misrepresentation?
That is accurate. They're certainly not used to it, but for the most part, it hasn't been a problem. I think culturally, to them, I'm more American than I am woman. And so, American is this other category. So,
right,
sort of their thoughts of how they might treat other women, they never think of treating me. But I did have a really funny meeting once, junior government official in Nigeria. And I was with a construction supervisor, and the government official refused to talk to me about the business. But I was just like, this is time for me to rest and solve a different problem in my head, and I'll just listen to make sure. And my guy actually answered all the questions right. So it was all good. But some people find it very unusual, but for the most part, people are excited that we're providing a service, and they don't care what gender the person is.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure having access to reliable electricity is paramount for folks who are suffering on $5 a day. Okay, you've obviously done a lot. You've worked at 2 startups now. You've done a variety of other things that are quite interesting, as you mentioned, Nicole. What resources have been useful for you in your journey, whether as a VC or a banker or somebody who joined a startup or somebody who's now running a startup that you founded? If somebody's looking at you and thinking, wow, what an impressive life she's led so far, I'd like to do something like her. Are there any things that you would recommend that they check out that have been helpful for you in your journey?
I will give more advice than say resources. Someone along the way told me something that I quote to people often, which is, those who know how work for those who know why. And I think that endeavoring to understand why is really powerful. particularly when you're dealing with new markets or new technology. It's just asking the questions to understand why. And I also would say that a lot of people, for instance, my background is not a technical solar background, and they ask, how can you run an engineering company? And I'd say, I just ask good questions. And so there's this power to asking good questions that I think is really critical. And everything we do, there's some statistics about young children ask questions, something like 100 times a day, 200 times a day, and adults ask questions once a day. That's good questions.
That's funny. So, I actually use, like, if one were to look at my ChatGPT log, it is primarily these questions that come up in my mind that are totally independent of anything. Like, I'll just that I would never look up on my own. I would never ask somebody, but I'll give you an insane example. I was thinking, if lava comes out of a volcano and it hits you because it's a rock that is hitting you, it's just a really hot rock, do you die first from being burned or do you die from being crushed? And I didn't know, so I asked ChatGPT. And for those of you wondering, you get burned first. The heat is way, way more deadly. But those are like the type of insane things that pop into my mind that are independent of anything else going on ever in my life that I ask all the time. So I must still be a child if I'm asking these types of questions on a regular basis.
A child in the very best way.
Yeah.
And so that would be the first thing, ask questions. Second is I read an insane amount, everything, nonfiction, fiction, but I think reading both, and I've read some particularly good books and I will recommend only one, but I've read some particularly good books too. But I just think the act of reading, both in terms of learning about people and increasing empathy, and also just learning skills, learning about people's lives, learning, about leadership, all the above. And then the two specific books, Atomic Habits and Dare to Lead.
Okay. Atomic Habits, a very popular, sat on the #1 bestseller for New York Times for many, many months, maybe even years, and Dare to Lead. So we'll include the link to both of those books in the show notes of this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com for those who want to go check out Nicole's recommendations. And finally, Nicole, I want to ask you, you're busy for the last decade trying to bring power to rural Africa. But I imagine, as somebody who's led the life that you've led, that there's probably a lot of other ideas out there that you hope that somebody will do that probably you're not going to do because you don't have the time. But is there any company that you think somebody else should start? Anything that you think would do some good and make some money that you would recommend to somebody if they're thinking, I really want to do something important in the world, but I just don't know what the idea is?
That's such a good question. And I think we'll keep it Africa focused, though I probably have more of those ideas in the US, but keeping it Africa focused, Africa, as they say, tremendous resources, underutilized or at best utilized in these sort of extractive ways where, it's just pulled out of the ground and then shipped someplace else. I think that there are tremendous opportunities to leverage the resources in Africa, available from Africa in Africa. And that can both be serving an African market, which is huge, fastest growing market on the continent in terms of on the planet in terms of population, but also in terms of a huge opportunity for wealth creation. So I think that there's a way to deliver product sustainably on the continent, for markets on the continent, and for markets for export. And so to just give a very specific answer that just popped in my head, there's a lot of battery technologies that are leveraging resources from Africa. Make it in Africa, which arguably will be more sustainable than transporting rocks across the globe so that someone else can make it.
Okay, very good. I like the way that you put it, transporting rocks across the globe. That's good. Nicole, Thanks so much. It's really great to talk with you. I'm impressed by what you are building. It's obviously very important for the world and for those who you're helping. But the fact that you're running an EBITDA positive startup, that puts you in a league of very rare caliber. So congratulations on that. And I'll be rooting for your success and looking forward to reading about the acquisition of Energicity when you surpass 100 million in revenue. All right.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.